Welcome to the Counseling Theory of H. Norman Wright presentation. Dr. Wright is a marriage, family, and child counselor and has written over 90 works. Dr. Wright graduated from Westmont College, Fuller Theological Seminary, Pepperdine University, and Phoenix School of Theology. Needless to say, Dr. Wright likes to study. He has been a professor at Biola University and has counseled in his own private practice for over 30 years. Currently, Dr. Wright is a research professor at Biola, focusing on grief and trauma counseling. He has provided at length many trauma and crisis workshops and seminars, including debriefings in New York City after 9/11, seminars after school shootings, and most recently, after the concert shootings in Las Vegas. For the duration of this presentation, we are going to be focusing on Dr. Wright's theory of crisis trauma and grief counseling, although his works and his study over the years, over his vast counseling experience, is much broader than just crisis trauma and grief, but due to his recent focus in this during his research professor at Biola University, this is what we will focus on. Dr. Wright's epistemology, his doctrine of knowledge, how he came to believe what he believes. He has his own personal experiences of crisis trauma and grief. Fresh out of seminary, while serving with youth at his church that he was serving at, Dr. Wright took a group of teenagers camping. One youth went climbing one morning, lost his footing, and plummeted to his death. This was Dr. Wright's first experience of a trauma debrief, his first trauma counseling experience when he got back to the church after the camping weekend, and he had to go and see the parents of this youth in his church. Another personal experience is his loss of his own son and the many losses throughout his son's life as his son was disabled. And on top of all of that are the many, many cases of trauma, crisis, and loss in his history as a counselor. Dr. Wright has a very high view of Scripture. He believes that Scripture speaks to how we handle trauma and grief. And he looks to the life of Jesus to share how a counselor can assist those that are going through grief and trauma and crisis. Dr. Wright's belief about man, his anthropology, his view of human nature. He believes that all are subjected to loss, trauma, and grief, that no one is immune. And life is made up of losses, either major or minor. Life is compounded by whether we lose a job or lose a son or lose our parents. Grief and loss are inevitable in this world. Dr. Wright believes that our personality is compounded by these losses, whether these life experiences are major or minor influences, all of them are influenced on our personality. And he believes that our physical, cognitive, emotional, and behavior all of these are affected by our trauma and loss. What is wrong with the world? As most Christian counselors, we believe that when sin entered the world, the consequences of sin entered as well. When death was claimed as the consequence of sin in the garden with Adam and Eve, um, this entered in the reality of loss and death into our world. But Dr. Wright believes that we are able to manage this life with death in our midst and have hope for a life in heaven, because that hope comes when Jesus came to rescue, um, when he came to rescue us, so we can have hope in Jesus. And the goal of counseling. The goal, according to Dr. Wright, is that we are able to recover from loss, recovery. But he believes that life after loss will not look the same as before the loss occurred. Just like in any type of grief process, we believe that the moment before the loss happens, you're never going to go back to before the loss occurred. But there can be a new normal, and that's the recovery that Dr. Wright believes in. His methodology, so how his counseling occurs, his process. Dr. Wright believes the role of the counselor is best modeled by the ultimate counselor himself, Jesus. Jesus showed compassion and acceptance. He expressed worth in people, and he met people's needs. He used appropriate words with them. He cared for them in their way that they needed him to. He also emphasized appropriate behavior and encouraged people to accept responsibility for their own sin. Ultimately, he provided hope. He also helped reshape the thinking of his followers, and he taught them. He he went into their lives and he taught them how to better themselves, make better decisions, and decisions reflecting their belief in him. He also spoke with authority, and he did not fear admonishing or confronting them, because he was able to do so with these character traits that we just listed, his compassion and his acceptance. And ultimately, he did all of this by encouraging the people that he walked alongside and counseled. And the role of the counselee is simply to trust and respond. Whenever the counselee has gone through crisis, trauma, and grief, ultimately that loss is there, and they must simply show up and trust that if they are able to see hope at the end, that they can respond in the now and they can trust the process. Speaking of process, Dr. Wright believes that the grief and loss processes are unique for every person. However, he sums this process up by evaluating the counselee's feelings and implementing ways to control those feelings. And that may go round and round and round for days, months, years, and decades, depending on the trauma and crisis in the individual. And ultimately, the process leads them to say goodbye to those feelings of, of loss and grief, to where they can accept the the new normal, as the grief process likes to put it, but as Dr. Wright likes to put it, the hope. Say goodbye so they can look forward to hope and live with a new perspective of hope following that crisis or trauma. And the goal or ideal of of counseling and therapy, according to Dr. Wright, is to recover to a state of hope, like we just spoke about, and a cognitive well-being. So the fears will diminish, anger will subside, rigidity will decrease, and appreciation for life and others will abound. And all of these things, their improvements will be noted by others around them, so that they are able to see the change that has occurred from their grief. And Dr. Wright, his ultimate belief of what brings power to change is hope. Hope is what pushes us whenever there is little that can be done, um, or there is nothing for us. But that hope is what pushes us forward to reach into those dark places and to process through pain. So, as I was studying and researching Norman Wright, there were a few things that stood out that I wanted to share with you. As fellow counselees, Dr. Wright, as a counselor, mm, I'm sorry, not a counselee, as a counselor, he shares that our role is to assist the counselee in their journey and to encourage them in their faith. So, some of the things that he said really stood out to me, and I want to share those with you. He said, "Don't give counselees false promises, but encourage them to solve their problems. Your belief in their capabilities will be important." And that's true. When you encourage someone to solve their problems and not to give solutions to them, they have the competence and they're building um, their belief in themselves. And I agree with Dr. Wright. Um, that is a precious place to be in a counselee's life. Another is many of those you and I will counsel won't be able to put into words what their lives of trauma are like. How true that is. When a counselee comes into your office or calls you and says, "I don't even know what to say," those are valid words. Sometimes trauma leaves no words, no response to what has happened in their lives. And we are put in the place to just sit with them and to be there when they do find words. Another, going to the scientific model of how all of this affects us physically. The brain is like a video camera. It tapes and stores not only what it sees, but also what it feels. And eh, Dr. Wright talks in depth in one of these resources that I studied about how our brains are affected by trauma and crisis. And I just want to encourage you to remember that sometimes there is there are things and consequences of sin in this world that have lasting effects on our physical bodies. And I encourage you to remember that whenever there is someone coming into your office month after month, year after year, to remember that they are people of a broken world. And lastly, these are the two works that I studied specifically for Dr. Wright's theory. Um, I hope you have enjoyed this presentation, and I hope that you check out those resources and get to know Dr. Wright like I have.